Hi, it's Mallory. We're still in the van. I just forgot what number I'm supposed to do. No, we are doing number 52, which is this one right here. So this is one of the published books. I don't know, it's not something that I worked incredibly hard polishing up, but it's printed. You can buy it if you want to. If you don't want to, I don't care. It's whatever. I do things because I'm bored, as you can tell. So this is the original draft of number 52, Dear Infidel. So I wanted to show you where this bad boy came from, if I can get it unwrapped. So it looks kind of the same as any other book, except I didn't do it in cursive. I added it in this big, bold print, because it's a big, bold story. It's not really. Yeah, so it's in this cute little green leather-bound book. You can, see my weird handwriting. Ugh. But, I don't know. I love handwritten stuff. I love physical books, handwritten books. I think they're very, vintage and cute, and it's my aesthetic. But then you look at something like this, and you're like, oh, that's real. It's bound, it's real, it's solid. And, look at that. Oh, look at that. And, come on. You can't beat that. It's amazing. So, context for this one. It's a bit grown up, so we're gonna put on our big girl pants and just deal with that. It is about a kind of cult situation taking over. I feel like I should just read it because the first chapter does give you all the context. So this is Dear Infidel, book number 52. Chapter 1. Sundays were the hardest. Most of the time I could ignore it, forget everything that had happened and pretend I was living this life by choice. But they wanted to remind us regularly that things were different now. We lived under a new regime, by new laws, a new order. That reminder came each Sunday. I woke up and Simon was there. Through the week, he'd wake up early to go to work, and by the time I got up, I had the bed to myself. But we woke up together on Sundays. He'd look at me in that apologetic way. He didn't have to look at me. Sometimes I felt it would be easier if we ignored each other completely. But something compelled him to acknowledge me from time to time. He showered first while I made breakfast. Then I'd shower and struggle to put on a balanced amount of makeup. Too much, and I was a whore. Too little, and I was a disgustingly poor representation of my husband. Simon was my husband. He shouldn't have been, but he was. I lived in his apartment, bore his name. I couldn't enter certain buildings without him, or without his spousal identification certificate. But it wasn't a real marriage. Nearly a year later, we still barely spoke, and couldn't stand to touch each other. I came out of the bathroom, and he waited for me to eat and wash my dishes. All of it in silence. Sometimes there was time to kill before we had to leave. We still wouldn't talk. We walked to the church. He had a car, but gas was too expensive now to use it every day. Church wasn't far, either. There were churches everywhere to make sure each region was thoroughly monitored. All of our neighbors paraded down the street with us. We filed into the building, passing armed officers who didn't hesitate to detain anyone who seemed suspicious. We belonged to the United Church of Redemption. Belonged as in they'd militarized and taken over about half the country by force. The coasts were said to have retained freedom, but we were the heartland, and the church had gutted them by stealing us. We weren't allowed to leave the new country, not even briefly. There were walls up now and border patrols, which they claimed were meant to keep out infidels. But no one wanted in. All the security measures were to make sure we were trapped. Simon and I were converts, meaning we were living in sin before the church seized power. I didn't fully grasp what that meant. By all accounts, I'd been a decent Christian. I didn't go to church services anymore, but I maintained my faith. The UCR was a cult before any of this began, just some weird denomination no one paid much attention to. When they took over, they rounded up civilians known to be outside their membership and gave us a choice. We could convert or be executed. I chose conversion, thinking it was the obvious choice. They gave me a new Bible outlining their laws. There was a men's testament and a women's testament. both written by the male church president. They dragged me out to a barn, and that was where I met Simon. They told me he was my husband now, and, guns out, demanded we perform the coupling ritual. They wanted us to consummate our union right then and there. My memory of that night wasn't clear. I knew something must have happened between Simon and me, or they'd have killed us. But I didn't recall it happening. All I knew was from then on we lived together and I belonged to him. Women were only allowed certain careers: servers, cooks, teachers, and nurses, with maybe a few exceptions, and only with their husband's approval. There were no single adults. Men could postpone coupling while getting an education, but women couldn't waste the childbearing years. It was primitive and degrading. At first I thought it would blow over, that women would simply step up and fight back, but they didn't. I realized there were plenty of older women in the church, not converts, but true believers. They wanted to live this way, and they used their influence on their daughters and young people. The new ways were taught in public schools. This would be the only life the next generation would ever know. Things wouldn't blow over. They'd only just begun. Simon and I sat and listened to the service. We had a local pastor, as well as a broadcast sermon from the church president. I wanted to tune out, but at the end, people were chosen at random to tell the congregation what they took away from the message. If they didn't answer in a satisfactory manner, they were locked in the pit overnight. Exactly as it sounds, it was a sub-ground prison with a gate at the top entrance. I'd heard they were more likely to put women in it, sometimes stripped naked, and the guards would spit and urinate on them all night. That was purely rumor, but I wasn't about to find out for myself if there was any truth to it. At the end of the service, all the converts had to line up in the aisle, and in our coupled pairs go to the altar. The pastor would reaffirm our commitment to each other and God, and we'd kiss. I'd kissed Simon countless times that way. It was empty and not as traumatizing as it maybe should have been. Other convert wives cried. They shuddered when their husbands touched them. They were yanked and grabbed and shaken until they learned to comply. Simon was gentle and polite. He didn't touch me unnecessarily. It was a simple kiss, and then we could leave. If I'd remembered our coupling, maybe things would have been different. I knew there was some sort of drug involved in the ritual to make things go faster, but other women definitely remembered the encounter. They were haunted by it. It was a miracle my brain had decided to block the memory, but I also had to wonder what had happened that was so painful I had to block it out. It should have ended there, but it never did. Even a year later, they still performed a weekly call of infidels. Some were self-declared. Nearly all my old friends had declared themselves at some point or another. I ran with a real brave crowd, and they weren't afraid to go out blazing. But at this point, most infidels had been turned in by a neighbor who'd witnessed their unholy behavior. It was a witch hunt, and the trials were short and never in the witch's favor. Their wrists bound, they were marched out in the churchyard, and forced to kneel in a row. The congregation had to stay and bear witness. The crimes were read: adultery, sodomy, heresy, very rarely something like theft or murder. Then, one by one, an officer would go down the line and raise a gun to their heads. It always reminded me of fireworks, a bright red spectacle with an echoing bang. You never think of fireworks as bombs. They're too far away to be dangerous. Seen from a distance, they're simply something to marvel at. And after a few weeks, that's what the call became. They weren't people, it wasn't blood. Just a spectacle that would come and go, and I'd move on with my life once the last shot was fired. We were dismissed after that. Everything was closed except emergency services, and families were to spend the rest of the day together. Simon would sit on the couch, typically, reading his Bible or whatever books we had that were safe enough if our home were to be inspected. I started making dinner. We ate in silence, washed our own dishes. We shared a bed. It was one of the things we discussed in our first days together, when we were still trying to figure out coexistence. He'd convinced me he had no intention of touching me, and even offered to sleep on the couch. But it didn't matter to me. Nothing had mattered. I'd lost everything basically overnight. My life hadn't been glamorous. I was a part owner of a tiny entertainment company, and not the part that handled money or booked gigs. We did weddings and bar shows, and I'd dress up as a kid's party princess. Obviously, I made almost no money in the venture, but it was more me than my day job. I worked in a library, not as a librarian because I didn't have the certification. I had a literature degree, and no clue what to do with it. So I made a living sorting book returns onto the shelves in hopes someone would ask for a recommendation or synopsis or any sort of input other than the internet password. But that tiny, inconsequential life had been all mine. I'd moved out of my parents' house, and after a brief stint crashing with a friend, I was holding my own. I was looking to start a new chapter, find out what I really wanted out of life. Now it didn't matter. For better or worse, I had Simon. That was my life. I would take care of his home and eventually his kids if the church got its way. We shared a bed, but other than our weekly altarkiss, he didn't touch me. He kept his back to me, and I really did appreciate it. He had license to do absolutely anything he wanted to me, but I'd been fortunate enough to get coupled with a genuinely decent man. Simon was a physical therapist at Granger Rehabilitation Center. From what I could tell, he was comfortable. His habits reflected he'd lived alone for a while, he was very clean, and left little for me to do around the house. But that could have been guilt. The first week of our marriage, when we were still speaking, every other word out of his mouth was an apology. Maybe it was that he got to keep his job and his apartment while mine were lost. Maybe it was that men's laws were more lax and women's punishments more harrowing. Maybe he had a clearer recollection of what he'd done to me during our coupling. But the man was sorry. Sunday nights, everything caught up with me. In the quiet and relative safety of this stranger's bed, I relaxed enough to break down. There weren't thoughts. My trauma wasn't compartmentalized enough for there to be words. It was just everything. The whole situation lumped together and weighing down on me. I had so many years left to live, and this was how I'd live them. There would be no variety, no change, no hope of anything better. I tried to cry silently, but I hadn't uttered a single sound all day, and I guess my vocal cords needed to avoid atrophy. Just one little audible sob. Simon got out of bed. He went out to the living room, where he'd spend the rest of the night. This was our every Sunday night without fail. I never asked why he left, but I assumed he just couldn't handle it. When I cried, it had to remind him of everything wrong. Even with his career intact, this wasn't the life he'd wanted either. For some reason, that made me cry harder. I'd ruined this guy's life. I was fully dependent on him, and I hated it. But there was nothing I could do. We just had to live this sad, horrible life, day in and day out, letting the people we were fade out of existence. And that is chapter 1. So it is kind of a more serious book. It's got some heaviness, it's got some themes, to be really vague. If you somehow are interested in the rest of this, it's available. You can find it on Amazon. You can find links to all my works on my website, MalloryHillAuthor.wordpress.com. There's a plug. I hated that. So anyway, that is number 52. Dear Infidel.